What if I told you that the fate of an entire empire once depended on the endurance of just 10,000 men standing against hundreds of thousands of enraged enemies? Roman Britain hung in the balance, cities burned, and legions retreated under the onslaught of unprecedented fury from the local population. This is not just a story about a battle, it is a textbook example of how cold calculation and iron discipline can break the back of overwhelming brute force. General Gaius Suetonius Paulinus found himself in a situation that any military council would have deemed hopeless, but he decided not to flee, but to fight. He chose a place where the enemy's numbers became their main weakness, turning an open field into a deadly trap. Watch the video to the end to find out how the Roman war machine crushed a rebellion that was supposed to wipe them off the face of the earth, and what tactical maneuver made victory inevitable. What if I told you that everything you believed about Roman diplomacy that year turned out to be a lie? The story of this conflict began not with the clash of swords, but with a gross mistake by Roman officials who decided that treaties with barbarians were worthless. After the death of Prasutagus, king of the Iceni, who bequeathed part of his kingdom to Emperor Nero in the hope of preserving the independence of the rest, the Romans behaved not as allies, but as marauders. Local procurators decided to annex all the tribe's property, completely ignoring local laws and traditions of succession. This was not just robbery, it was a public humiliation of the ruling house, which stirred up hatred in every inhabitant of the island. Queen Boudica, the king's widow, was subjected to cruel treatment that was intended to break her spirit, but instead forged her into a symbol of vengeance. The Roman administration, accustomed to the obedience of conquered peoples, did not expect such a turn of events. They considered the Iceni to be peaceful and loyal, not noticing how a storm of incredible power was brewing beneath the surface of calm. The veterans settled in the colony of Camulodunum behaved provocatively, taking land from the locals and treating them like slaves. The temple of Emperor Claudius, built in this city, became a symbol of oppression, requiring constant financial injections from an already impoverished population. Tension grew over the years, accumulating like water behind a dam ready to burst. The Romans were blinded by their power and did not see that they themselves were putting weapons in the hands of their future killers. When the uprising broke out, it was like a forest fire that could not be stopped by conventional means. The Iceni were immediately joined by their neighbors, the Trinovantes, who also had a long list of grievances against the Roman invaders. A huge mass of people, armed not only with weapons but also with righteous anger, moved on the Roman settlements, sweeping away everything in their path. This was not an organized army in the Roman sense. It was a force of nature driven by a single goal: to destroy everything foreign. The first victim was Camulodunum, a city that did not even have fortress walls, as the Romans felt completely safe. Veterans accustomed to formation combat found themselves locked in the Temple of Claudius, where they held out for only 2 days against the ocean of attackers. The city was burned to the ground and its inhabitants destroyed, which was the first terrible signal for the entire province. Statues of victory were toppled, and symbols of Roman power were trampled into the mud and ashes. The 9th Legion, commanded by Quintus Petilius Cerialis, attempted to come to the aid of the besieged city, but fell into a well-organized ambush. The legionaries, accustomed to open combat, were surrounded in forests and swamps, where their formation had no advantage. The infantry was almost completely destroyed, and only the cavalry and their commander managed to escape. This defeat showed all the wavering tribes that the Romans could be defeated, and the influx of warriors into Boudica's army increased many times over. Governor Suetonius Paulinus was at the other end of the island at the time, engaged in destroying the stronghold of the Druids on the island of Mona. He received news of the uprising with a delay, which gave the rebels precious time to expand their zone of control. He had to interrupt his campaign and march south through hostile territory. Every hour of delay cost Rome hundreds of lives and the loss of strategic initiative. Boudica's army grew daily, becoming a giant but poorly controlled machine of destruction. They captured Roman warehouses, arming themselves with captured weapons and food supplies. The Britons were absolutely confident of victory, for they had already destroyed one legion and burned the main city of the colony. They believed that the gods were on their side, and that the time of Roman rule on the island had come to an end. Roman intelligence reported the movements of huge masses of people, but it was impossible to estimate the exact number of enemies due to the chaos. Suetonius understood that he was facing a force many times greater than his own capabilities. He needed a miracle, or a brilliant plan to stop this avalanche. He was an experienced commander who had fought in the mountain wars in the Atlas, but here the conditions were completely different. In Rome, Emperor Nero, having received news of the disaster, even considered the possibility of a complete evacuation from the island. The loss of Britain seemed inevitable, and only Suetonius' determination kept the province from complete collapse. It was a moment of truth, when the strength of the entire imperial system of government and military organization was being tested. The fate of thousands of Roman citizens now depended on the decisions of one man. Suetonius continued his march to Londinium, hoping to save this important trading hub. But what he saw upon his arrival forced him to make the most difficult decision of his life. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about how one administrative error can lead to such catastrophic consequences? Write about it in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to the channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about how an entire city was sentenced to death? Suetonius Paulinus arrived in Londinium ahead of his main forces to assess the situation. He saw a thriving commercial center full of people, goods, and supplies, but completely unprepared for defense. The city had no walls, and the garrison was too small to repel an attack by Boudica's huge army. The general knew that trying to hold the city would lead to his army being surrounded and totally destroyed. His legions were tired from the long march, and reinforcements were still far away. Suetonius calmly weighed the pros and cons, viewing the city not as a home for thousands of people, but as a point on a strategic map. He made the decision to abandon Londinium, sacrificing it for the sake of saving the province as a whole. The city's inhabitants begged the general for protection, offering any money and resources they had. But Suetonius was adamant, declaring that anyone who could walk should join his column. Those who could not leave the city due to age, illness, or attachment to their property were left to their fate. It was a cruel but, from a military point of view, the only correct move. As soon as the Roman army left the city, the rebel troops stormed in. Londinium was looted and burned to the ground, and the remaining inhabitants perished in the fire or at the hands of the rebels' swords. Archaeologists still find a thick layer of red ash under modern London, silent evidence of that terrible fire. The burning temperature was so high that clay and glass melted. The rebels' next target was Verulamium, another large city loyal to Rome. The scenario repeated itself. The city was destroyed, and its population exterminated with particular cruelty. The Britons took no prisoners and sold no people into slavery. They wanted the complete destruction of the Roman presence. It seemed that the rebels' anger could not be satisfied. Meanwhile, Suetonius continued his march, gathering all available forces into a single fist. He added parts of the 20th Legion and all available auxiliary troops to his 14th Legion. But even after that, his army numbered barely 10,000 men. It was a drop in the ocean compared to the horde following in his footsteps. The general knew that he could not escape the light-footed British army. He had to choose the time and place for the final battle himself. He was looking for a position that would level the enemy's numerical superiority. Suetonius carefully studied maps and intelligence reports, rejecting one option after another. He understood the psychology of his enemies. They were intoxicated by their victories and thirsted for the final defeat of the Romans. They pursued him, confident that the Romans were fleeing in panic. This self-confidence of the Britons became a key factor in Suetonius' plan. He lured them in by creating the illusion of weakness and indecision. At the same time, iron discipline was maintained in the Roman camp. The soldiers understood that there would be no retreat, and that defeat would mean death. This understanding united the ranks better than any speeches or promises. They trusted their commander, who had led them to victory many times before. Suetonius finally found what he was looking for, a narrow valley protected from the rear by dense forest. Here, on Watling Street, the fate of Britain would be decided. But how exactly could the terrain help a handful of soldiers against an endless wave of enemies? What if I told you that Rome's greatest victory in Britain was won before the first sword was even drawn? The choice of battle position at Watling Street is rightly considered an absolute masterpiece of tactical art by the commander Gaius Suetonius Paulinus. He masterfully chose a place where the landscape itself began to work for him as an additional legion. The general managed to turn the critical weaknesses of his catastrophically small army into its main advantages. The field of the upcoming battle was a narrow, rocky defile, securely limited on the flanks by dense forests and steep hills. From the rear, the Roman positions were completely covered by impenetrable forest, completely ruling out any possibility of a surprise attack. No enemy unit could get through this thicket to strike the defenders from behind. Before the Roman front stretched a wide, flat, open plain that gradually narrowed as it approached their ranks. This natural geometry created a deadly funnel effect that worked against the attackers. It forced the huge, disorganized mass of enemies to inevitably bunch up into a dense cluster. The closer the enraged Britons approached the Roman ranks, the tighter it became for them in this narrow throat. Their enormous numerical advantage, which was supposed to guarantee victory, instantly lost all meaning. The warriors got in each other's way, pressed against their neighbors, and could not swing their long swords freely. The rear ranks of the barbarians pushed against the front, depriving them of maneuverability and turning them into easy targets. Suetonius used the enemy's greed against them. The Roman formation was skillfully deployed at the narrowest point of this natural trap, tightly blocking the only passage. Suetonius placed his best legionaries in the center, putting the most experienced and heavily armed veteran units at the front. This was the iron core of the army, against which the wave of attack was to break. On the flanks, he prudently placed lighter auxiliary infantry armed with long spears and throwing javelins. The Roman cavalry was grouped on the extreme flanks, ready at any moment to launch a counterattack or pursue the fleeing enemy. The horsemen covered the edges of the infantry formation, giving the enemy no chance to infiltrate from the side. This deeply echeloned formation ensured that the Romans would not have to fight against a front wider than their own. This evened the odds of 10,000 Romans against a huge horde of rebels. The Britons were physically unable to flank the Roman formation or surround it because of the dense forest and steep hills. They had to attack head-on, wave after wave, straight into the bristles of the Roman pilums. They were forced to run into an impenetrable wall of large shields and short stabbing swords. Suetonius literally forced the enemy to play by his rules, depriving the barbarians of their favorite tactic of encirclement. The legionaries stood in tight, closed ranks, ready to instantly replace tired frontline fighters with fresh forces from the rear. This continuous rotation was the basis of the invincible Roman tactic, which allowed them to maintain a high tempo of battle for hours. While the barbarians were exhausted and tired of wielding their weapons, a wall of fresh and strong soldiers always rose before them. Each legionnaire knew his place in the ranks and his maneuver clearly, constantly feeling the reliable shoulder of his comrade. In this narrow stone passage, they were like a solid cork in a bottle that could not be knocked out by any external pressure. The formation became a single living organism, protected by iron and discipline. The individual skill of the Celts was shattered by the collective work of the Roman military machine. No one could break through this monolith without paying for it with their life. Before the battle began, Suetonius personally inspected the ranks. meticulously checking the readiness of every centurion and every ordinary soldier. He did not make long, pompous speeches typical of politicians, but his icy calmness was transmitted to the troops. The general's entire demeanor showed that the situation was under complete control, and the plan was flawless. His confidence became the backbone that kept the army's spirits up in the face of imminent death. He explained his simple plan to the soldiers briefly and clearly. Keep formation, take advantage of the enemy's crowding, and wait for the signal. The Romans understood perfectly well that their only chance of survival depended on how precisely they carried out their commander's orders. There was no room for individual heroism here. Only the coordinated work of the entire legion was important. The soldiers trusted their commander, who had led them to victory many times before. The dense forest behind them provided not only physical protection, but also important psychological comfort. There was nowhere to retreat. It was impossible to run through the thicket in armor, but there was no need to fear a treacherous attack from behind. Ahead lay only a countless enemy horde, and the only way to salvation was through their corpses and complete victory. This created an atmosphere of extreme concentration and grim determination to hold out among the legionnaires. Soon, mounted scouts reported that Queen Boudica's huge army was already entering the plain, filling it from edge to edge. Suetonius gave strict orders for everyone to remain completely silent in order to increase the psychological pressure on the enemy. The Romans stood motionless, like statues, without making a sound, while the barbarians shouted and beat their shields. In this natural amphitheater, the ominous silence of the Roman ranks sounded louder than the battle cries of thousands of savages. The position was perfectly chosen from a military point of view, but would it withstand the monstrous pressure of a living sea of people? The Romans placed their main bet on their iron training and discipline against the unbridled primitive fury of the Celts. The stakes in this game were as high as possible, the lives of each of them and the fate of the entire British province of Rome. Like this video if you also admire such cold-blooded calculation. Guess what happened next when hundreds of thousands of warriors, confident in their invincibility, took to the battlefield? Boudica's army was an impressive and terrifying sight, filling the horizon. It was not just an army, it was a migration of entire peoples who had come to witness the final fall of Rome. The warriors were painted blue, their hair was disheveled and covered with lime to make them look frightening. The noise they made was deafening. Shouting, the clanging of swords against shields, the roar of Carnicus war horns. Carnicus's long bronze horns with animal head-shaped mouthpieces produced blood-curdling sounds. This acoustic terror was part of Celtic tactics designed to break the enemy's spirit before the battle even began. The Britons jumped, danced, and displayed their weapons, mocking the small group of Romans. At the forefront of the army were chariots, maneuverable platforms from which warriors threw javelins. The charioteers skillfully controlled their horses, turning at full speed and crashing into the enemy ranks. For the Romans, this was an old-fashioned but still dangerous weapon capable of wreaking havoc on their formation. Behind the chariots followed an endless mass of infantry, armed with long swords and spears. The Britons were so confident that they brought their families with them to watch the battle. Behind the army, in a semicircle, was a huge convoy of carts and wagons. On these carts sat the wives, mothers, and sisters of the warriors, ready to celebrate victory and share the rich spoils. This improvised amphitheater blocked the exit from the battlefield, but the Britons did not think about that. Boudica rode in front of her army in a chariot, accompanied by her daughters, who had also suffered at the hands of the Romans. She was a tall woman with waist-length red hair, wearing a bright cloak and a gold necklace around her neck. Her speech was full of passion. She called on them to fight not for wealth, but for freedom and revenge for their violated honor. She said that the Romans were nothing but thieves and rapists hiding behind their armor. The warriors responded with enthusiastic cheers, ready to tear the enemy apart with their bare hands. they saw before them only a handful of people trapped between the forest and their huge army. The number of Britons, according to various estimates, ranged from 80,000 to 230,000, which was dozens of times greater than the forces of Suetonius. It seemed to them that one powerful attack would be enough to sweep away this obstacle. However, this huge mass was poorly organized and controlled. Each chief commanded his own detachment, and there was virtually no overall coordination of actions. They relied on individual skill and ferocity rather than complex maneuvers. The confinement that Suetonius had created for them prevented them from deploying their forces fully. The Britons began to gather in front of the entrance to the defile, crowding their ranks to the limit. They jostled each other, getting in each other's way, and the most impatient were already rushing into battle without orders. The pressure from the rear ranks on the front ones grew with every passing minute. The wave was ready to crash into the stone. The Romans, however, remained motionless, responding neither to the provocations nor the insults. The contrast between the raging sea of barbarians and the granite wall of legions was striking. The Britons interpreted this calmness as fear, which only strengthened their desire to attack. The tension reached its peak when the British vanguard began to advance in disorder. The chariots rushed into the attack, raising clouds of dust and earth. The battle that would determine the fate of Britain had begun. But how long can one man hold out against 10? The Roman legions stood in absolute, ominous silence, like thousands of statues carved from cold stone. This unnatural calm was an essential part of their psychological preparation before battle. The regulations strictly forbade making any sound or moving until the centurion gave the special command. The bright sun played on the perfectly polished helmets and metal umbones of the shields, creating a dazzling wall of light. This glare was intended to blind the enemy and show them the wealth and power of the empire. Each legionnaire in the ranks clutched his pilum tightly in his right hand, a heavy throwing spear with a long iron tip. It was the main and most fearsome weapon of the first strike, capable of piercing any shield. Their fingers turned white with tension, but their hands did not tremble, ready at any moment to launch the deadly projectile. The men were like coiled springs, waiting for the moment to spring. There was no hint of panic in the dense ranks of the Romans, despite the truly terrifying sight and sound of the approaching wild horde. Experienced veterans who had fought in dozens of battles knew perfectly well that animal fear was a soldier's worst enemy. They relied entirely on discipline and on the shoulder of the comrade standing to their right in the ranks. This sense of solidarity transformed the crowd of people into a single, monolithic organism. The stern centurions, experienced combat officers, stood motionless in their places, carefully monitoring the distance to the enemy. Their eyes, accustomed to estimating distance, worked like precise range-finders. They waited patiently for that one perfect moment when the enemy would be within range of certain defeat. They could not throw too early, lest they waste their ammunition, but they could not delay either. The legion's formation was deliberately deep, allowing it to withstand even the strongest and most furious onslaught of the barbarians. The front ranks consisted of the most experienced and strongest fighters, who were to take the first terrible blow. Behind them stood younger soldiers, ready to instantly replace fallen or tired comrades in the front line. This rotation allowed the formation to maintain its freshness and striking power for a long time. The large rectangular scutum shields were tightly joined at the edges, forming a continuous protective surface resembling the scales of a giant fish. This wall was virtually impenetrable to most types of primitive barbarian weapons. The legionnaires' legs were spread wide apart for maximum stability when pushing forward. The thick soles of the soldiers' caligae sandals were studded with iron nails that dug firmly into the ground, preventing them from slipping. Commander Suetonius stood on a small hill in the rear, from where he could see the entire battlefield at a glance. He made a point of not interfering in the command of individual cohorts, placing complete trust in the experience of his combat officers. His main strategic task was to choose the right moment to bring in fresh reserves and launch a cavalry flank attack. He watched with satisfaction as a huge wave of Britons rolled into the narrow throat of the valley. The enemies, constrained by the geometry of the terrain, were bunched together in a dense and unmanageable mass, hindering each other. The auxiliary troops on the flanks also remained ice-cold calm, keeping their long spears at the ready. Archers and slingers standing behind the main formation were already loading arrows and stones, preparing their projectiles. The air above the valley was literally electrified with physical anticipation of the inevitable bloody clash. The soldiers' hearts beat in unison, obeying the rhythm and adrenaline of the impending deadly battle. When the first rows of roaring Britons approached a lethal distance of about 30 meters, a short command passed through the Roman ranks. Thousands of hands simultaneously and in unison raised their pila above their heads, preparing for the final throw. This sudden movement was so synchronized that it seemed like the work of a single giant mechanism, not living people. The enemy, completely unprepared for such frightening coordination, hesitated for a moment and slowed down. At this critical moment, the dead silence was broken by the sharp and piercing sound of battle trumpets signaling the attack. It was not the chaotic roar of the crowd, but a clear, distinct, and terrifying order to kill. The Roman war machine finally sprang into action, moving from passive waiting to active destruction. The monstrous psychological tension that had built up was released in a single brief moment. The soldiers took a synchronized step forward, gathering momentum with their whole bodies for a powerful throw. All the energy accumulated during long hours of motionless waiting was put into this one blow. They knew that the first volley had to be absolutely devastating in order to immediately stop the attackers' momentum. There was no mercy in their actions, no hesitation, only dry movements honed by years of training. The Britons, who had rushed into the attack with their mouths open, simply did not have time to react to this instant change. They were sure that the Romans were frightened and would only passively defend themselves behind their shields. The sudden transition from statuesque immobility to deadly activity came as a real shock to the barbarians. Death was already flying towards them at the speed of a thrown spear. The famous Roman silence was replaced by the characteristic whistling of thousands of flying heavy javelins. The sky darkened for a second from the thick hail of metal and wood that covered the sun. This moment became the point of no return for both armies, after which only the victors would remain alive. Are you ready to learn the secret of the Roman pilum that rendered enemy shields useless? A volley of Roman javelins rained down on the front ranks of the advancing Britons with terrifying efficiency. The pilum was designed so that its long iron tip would pierce the shield and, often, the man behind it. The weight of the shaft made it impossible to pull out the javelin or chop it off in battle. The Britons' shields, pierced by pilums, became a heavy and cumbersome burden that hindered their fighting. The warriors had to throw them away, leaving themselves defenseless against the short Roman swords. Many were killed or wounded before they could even approach the Roman formation. The attack faltered, and the front ranks became entangled, stumbling over the bodies of the fallen. The Romans did not give the enemy time to recover and hurled a second wave of pilums. The effect was devastating. The dense mass of people in the narrow defile was an ideal target. It was impossible to miss, and every javelin found its mark. The Britons' formation turned into chaos, with screaming people losing their bearings. At that moment, Suetonius gave the order to attack. The legions did not simply advance, they formed wedges, battle formations in the shape of a triangle, with their points directed at the enemy. This formation allowed them to strike the disordered ranks of the enemy with maximum force, cutting them to pieces. It was like a knife cutting through butter. The Romans moved in unison, covering themselves with shields and delivering short, stabbing blows with their gladiuses. The gladius, the Roman sword, was the ideal weapon for close combat. A legionnaire did not need to swing wide. He only needed a few centimeters of space to inflict a fatal wound. The Britons, with their long swords, needed space to swing, which they now lacked. In the narrow space created by the terrain and the pressure of the rear ranks, the Britons found themselves trapped. They could not effectively use their numerical advantage. Roman wedges cut into the crowd, knocking down and trampling their opponents. The disciplined formation crushed the disorganized mass. Supporting infantry on the flanks backed up the legion's advance, preventing the Britons from encircling the Roman formations. Archers continued to shower the enemy's rear ranks with arrows, increasing the panic. The Roman machine worked flawlessly, each element performing its function. The noise of battle changed. Instead of war cries, there were now cries of pain and horror. The Britons tried to resist, but their individual bravery was crushed by the collective strength of the legion. They fell by the dozens, unable to strike back. The Romans marched over the bodies without stopping for a second. Blood soaked the ground, making it slippery, but the spikes on the soles of the Roman sandals provided a secure grip. The legionaries worked like butchers, methodically and cold-bloodedly doing their job. Fatigue was beginning to set in, but adrenaline and the sight of the retreating enemy gave them strength. It seemed that the very nature of this place was helping the Romans, directing their enemies straight to their swords. But the battle was far from over. Would the Romans be able to maintain this pace of killing until the end? Seeing that the enemy's formation was beginning to break down, Suetonius brought his last reserve into battle, the cavalry. The Roman horsemen, spears at the ready, struck the flanks of the Britons, finally breaking their resistance. The heavy cavalry broke through the ranks of the infantry, trampled the fallen, and sowed panic in the depths of the enemy army. It was a hammer blow to an already cracked anvil. The Britons, trapped on three sides, by Roman infantry from the front and cavalry from the flanks, began a spontaneous retreat. Panic gripped the huge army, and the soldiers who had been thirsty for blood just a moment ago now thought only of salvation. They turned and ran back, hoping to take refuge in the forests or scatter across the plain. But a terrible surprise awaited them. The path to retreat was blocked by their own supply train. The very carts with families, arranged in a semicircle to watch the triumph, had turned into an insurmountable wall. The passages between the carts were too narrow for the huge mass of fleeing people. A crush of monstrous force formed. People were crushing each other, trying to crawl under the carts or climb over them. The animals harnessed to the carts were frightened by the noise and smell of blood, adding to the chaos. The Britons found themselves trapped by their own overconfidence. They were caught between the relentless advance of the Romans and a wall of wood and bodies. The Romans caught up with those running at the rear of the convoy. Here, the battle turned into a slaughter. The legionnaires did not even need to look for the enemy. Before them was a solid wall of human bodies. They continued to strike, methodically destroying everything alive in front of them. Not only soldiers died in this crush, but also women and old people who had come with the baggage train. In the heat of battle, the Romans made no distinctions. Their goal was the complete destruction of the threat. The order was clear: take no prisoners until the battle was over. Pity remained somewhere far away, beyond this field of death. The horses of the Roman cavalry fought their way through the piles of bodies. The horsemen struck with their spears those who tried to organize any resistance on the carts. Cries of horror mingled with the crack of breaking wood and the clang of metal. It was the end of the Iceni's hopes for freedom. Some Britons tried to fight with their backs to the carts, realizing that they could not escape. They fought with the desperation of the doomed, but they had no chance against the coordinated Roman machine. Their heroism was drowned out by the general chaos and panic. The wall of shields advanced further and further, squeezing the space to a minimum. By the end of the day, the field in front of the wagon train was covered with a carpet of bodies. The Romans stopped only when the resistance had completely ceased. The silence that fell over the valley was more terrifying than the noise of battle. The trap, created by pride and poor planning, had snapped shut, burying the flower of the Briton tribes beneath it. When the dust settled, the victors were confronted with a scene of utter devastation. Roman historians, notably Tacitus, claim that around 80,000 Britons died that day. Roman losses amounted to only about 400 killed and slightly more wounded. This ratio seems incredible, but it confirms the effectiveness of the chosen tactics and discipline. The legionaries, exhausted to the limit, leaned on their blood-stained shields. Their armor was dented, their swords blunted from endless blows. But in their eyes you could see the realization that they had accomplished the impossible. They had survived where they should have died and saved the province from complete destruction. They searched for Boudica among the bodies. According to one version, she took poison so as not to be captured by the Romans. According to another, she died of illness shortly after the battle. Her death was the final nail in the coffin of the uprising. Without their charismatic leader, and after such a terrible defeat, the tribes could no longer resist. The Romans did not celebrate their victory immediately. They set about collecting their weapons and helping their wounded comrades. Discipline was maintained even after the battle. The camp was set up according to all the rules, and sentries were posted. Suetonius understood that it was too early to relax. The Britons' supply train had been plundered, but the soldiers were now little interested in valuables. The main trophy was life itself. The surviving Britons scattered into the forests, but their spirit was broken for good. They understood that Rome's military power was unshakable. This battle was a turning point in the history of Britain. Roman rule was established on the island for the next 350 years. The local elites realized that resistance was futile and began the process of Romanization. The culture, language, and architecture of Rome began to penetrate deep into the island. Suetonius Paulinus confirmed his reputation as a brilliant commander, but his harshness raised questions even in Rome. He was soon recalled and replaced by a more diplomatic governor. The empire realized that it was too expensive to hold the provinces by force alone and began to change its policy. The battlefield at Watling Street became a huge mass grave for thousands of people. Nature quickly healed the scars on the land, but the memory of the massacre remained in legends. It was a terrible reminder of what happens when two irreconcilable forces clash. The Roman eagles once again soared over Britain, but the price of this triumph was enormous. Analyzing this grand battle centuries later, military historians still sincerely admire the decisions made by Suetonius Paulinus. The Battle of Watling Street has become a textbook and classic example of the ingenious use of difficult terrain. This concept is known in military science as a force multiplier, when the landscape fights on your side. The general clearly showed the whole world that the total size of an army is not a decisive factor in victory. Even a huge army is doomed if it cannot properly deploy and use its lethal potential. The cunning Roman turned the disadvantages of his position into a deadly trap for the enemy. He narrowed the front of attack so much that the numerical superiority of the Britons only hindered them. The enemy was forced to squeeze through a narrow bottleneck, where they were met by trained fighters. It was a triumph of intellect over brute physical force. Iron discipline and precise organization proved much stronger than blind rage and overwhelming numerical superiority that day. The Roman training system, which allowed soldiers to act as a single coordinated organism, proved its complete superiority. The individual heroism of the barbarians, where each fought for himself, was shattered against a wall of shields. The Romans did not seek personal glory in combat. They simply methodically carried out their bloody work. Each legionnaire was just a small but reliable cog in this huge machine of death. And this machine worked flawlessly, grinding down wave after wave of attackers. Mutual assistance and a sense of camaraderie made the formation monolithic and indestructible. It was a victory of system over mob, of order over anarchy. The main and fatal mistake of the Britons was their criminal underestimation of the enemy. and complete disregard for tactics. They allowed their violent emotions and thirst for revenge to control their actions on the battlefield. This blindness led them straight into a trap prepared in advance by the Romans. They were so confident of an easy victory that they did not even consider the possibility of defeat. The placement of a huge convoy with families in the rear, which was supposed to motivate the warriors, became the main reason for their terrible demise. The carts created an impenetrable wall, cutting off all routes of retreat when luck turned away from the rebels. The people found themselves trapped between Roman swords and their own carts. This is a cruel lesson in how excessive self-confidence can be fatal for an entire nation. The quality of the weapons also played a huge role in the outcome of this confrontation. The short Roman gladius and the large convex scutum shield proved to be ideal tools for fighting in confined spaces. A legionnaire could deliver deadly stabbing blows with virtually no swing and no exposure. The shield reliably covered the body from head to knee, creating a solid wall. At the same time, the long cutting swords of the Britons were completely useless in such a terrible crush. They needed space to swing, which the Romans simply did not give them. The barbarians got in each other's way, their blows stuck in shields or hit their own men. The technological and tactical superiority of the Roman army was obvious and overwhelming. The battle also vividly demonstrated the critical importance of leadership in extreme conditions. Suetonius kept his cool in the most critical situation, when his army could have been wiped out. He made difficult, risky, but absolutely necessary decisions on which the lives of every soldier depended. His confidence spread to the troops, compelling them to fight to the death. Boudica, on the other hand, despite being a powerful and inspiring symbol and icon of the uprising, was unable to provide competent military leadership. She lacked the means to control her diverse and unruly tribal forces. A charismatic personality can easily start a rebellion and rally the people to fight. But to win a real war, you need cold strategy and tight control, which she did not have. For the proud Iceni tribe and their allies, it was a terrible tragedy that destroyed them as an independent force. The field was littered with tens of thousands of bodies, and the resistance was broken forever. For Rome, it was further confirmation of its status as the undisputed ruler of the world. The empire had proven that it was capable of holding on to its provinces at any cost. For world history, it will forever remain a vivid, instructive, and incredibly bloody episode in the annals of humanity. It is a reminder of how a single battle can determine the fate of an entire island for centuries to come. We remember the victors and the vanquished, trying to learn from their mistakes and their deeds. After almost 2,000 years, the historical figure of Boudica has undergone a surprising and paradoxical transformation in the minds of her descendants. From a fierce enemy of Rome and a cruel barbarian queen, she has become Britain's greatest national heroine. Her cult flourished particularly during the Victorian era, when another great woman ruled the empire. Poets and artists of the time romanticized her image, making her a symbol of the indomitable British spirit and resistance to any invaders. Today, a majestic bronze statue of Boudica on a chariot stands proudly at Westminster Bridge in the heart of London. The irony is that it stands in the heart of the very city that she once mercilessly burned to the ground. The Roman commander Suetonius Paulinus remains in the dry pages of history only as an effective but extremely cruel professional of war. His name is well known to specialist historians and tacticians, but nowhere are monuments erected to him or poems dedicated to him. It is a cruel irony of fate. The real victor has been forgotten, while the woman he defeated has become an immortal legend. This often happens because human memory and history love colorful personalities and beautiful tragic destinies. Cold calculation and discipline command respect, but they do not give rise to myths that can live on for centuries. Modern archaeological finds continue to shed light on the bloody events of that distant time, filling in the gaps. Under the streets of London and Colchester, Thick layers of fire and ash remain from the Queen's wrath. Hordes of Roman coins, hidden in panic by residents under the floor before fleeing, are found thousands of years later. Elements of lost weapons and broken bones allow scientists to reconstruct the picture of the past, literally minute by minute. Thanks to these silent witnesses, we learn more about the lives and terrible deaths of ordinary people who found themselves in the millstones of history. The Battle of Watling Street is not just another bloody military episode in a textbook. It was a global clash between two different worlds, two great civilizations, and two polar ways of life. The Iron Roman order and law collided with the indomitable Celtic freedom and elemental force. The ruthless state machine of the empire tried to crush the loose tribal union, which was held together by the charisma of its leader. The outcome of this grand clash largely determined the path of development not only of Britain, but of all of Europe for centuries to come. Rome's heavy material legacy remained forever in the straight roads, city planning, laws, and even the language. But Boudica's rebellious spirit did not disappear, remaining an eternal symbol of the struggle for personal freedom and independence. These two powerful forces, merging in the historical melting pot, formed the unique Britain we know today. Imperial systematicity and island stubbornness intertwined, creating a nation that built its own empire. The blood of the Romans and Celts mixed, giving birth to a new culture. Today we look back through the centuries, not to judge the participants in those events. Our goal is to try to understand the motives behind their actions and the logic of that brutal era. We must realize the true cost of the leaders' excessive ambitions, the cost of the generals' fatal mistakes, and the cost of the people's freedom. The history of the Battle of Watling Street teaches us an important lesson that is still relevant today. Even in the darkest, most frightening, and most hopeless situations, the human spirit and a cool head are capable of achieving the impossible. The story of the Battle of Watling Street is a stark reminder that in war, it is not the loudest who wins, but the best thinkers. The discipline, training, and strategic genius of Suetonius Paulinus were able to stop the seemingly inevitable demise of Roman Britain. But the price of this lesson was paid with the blood of tens of thousands of people and the ashes of burned cities. Was Suetonius a hero who saved civilization, or a ruthless executioner? Or perhaps the true hero was Boudica, who dared to challenge the most powerful empire in the world? We are very interested in hearing your point of view. What do you think about the moral side of this conflict? Write about it in the comments. If you want us to analyze the tactics of other great battles of antiquity, write their names. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, there's a lot more history ahead of us.